When I have been reading recently in computer science, one of the things that I'm really struck by is the way the computer scientists talk about modularity as a means to obtain flexibility, not a constraint on it. So the way I think that some of us, at least in evolutionary psychology, think about modularity is as a way to think about all the possible combinations that you can form in terms of your mind or your representations. So I guess I would push back a little bit on this notion that you can do anything or think anything. The way I would sort of think about it is that every thought you have is generated by a thought generation system of some kind, or a combination of many different ones. And so when I think about the panoply of all possible thoughts humans can have, including the tools that we can use and political institutions that we can have, these are all the product of evolved computational mechanisms.
Welcome to This View of Life, where we take a deep dive with the best and brightest thinkers on anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. I am your host, David Sloan Wilson. For more interviews, articles, videos, and special publications, search for This View of Life on your favorite search engine. Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson with another podcast for Evolution, This View of Life, the new magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. I am at the Society for Evolutionary Analysis in Law, and speaking today with Robert Kurzban, who is one of our best well-known evolutionary psychologists, who's here and is a regular at the meetings. And so welcome, Rob.
Thanks for having me.
And so I'm really anxious to discuss evolutionary psychology in general, and also your new book, Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite, Evolution and the Modular Mind, which was published this year by Princeton University Press. But let's begin by talking about the field of evolutionary psychology, when it emerged, and how it was different than what preceded it.
Sure. So a lot of people trace the beginning of the field to 1975, the publication of Sociobiology by E.O. Wilson. And in many respects, that was one of the first attempts to think carefully about applying the theory of evolution by natural selection to human behavior, specifically human social behavior. And after that point, the field developed in a number of different ways, with landmarks including Don Simon's book in 1979, The Evolution of Human Sexuality, and development since then. The way that many of us think about the difference between sociobiology and the modern incarnation of evolutionary psychology is that since E.O. Wilson, the cognitive revolution happened. And so people who call themselves evolutionary psychologists, many of them, although maybe not all of them, incorporate the computational theory of mind into their work. And of course, there's many different stripes of evolutionary psychology, and many people consider themselves evolutionary psychology who are more or less cognitive. But certainly the field has come quite a long way since E.O. Wilson's work. And in terms of what the field is, it really is just the application of insights from evolutionary biology into the study of human social behavior. The idea is that we can do better work in psychology by thinking carefully about about evolution and the principles that underlie the theories.
So where does modularity come into it?
One of the things that you see in the natural world is specialization. So I don't have to convince you, or probably your listeners, that if you look at organisms, they occupy niches in which they are specialized to do whatever it is they need to do to survive and reproduce. And even in the context of these organisms, their different parts are specialized. So you have, Darwin's beaks of the finches, each one of which was really well designed to exploit the resources on the island. And the idea is just that specialization, by virtue of the principles of engineering, yields efficiency. So in evolution, of course, what matters is being able to do your job better than the next guy does. And what modularity does is it just applies this notion of specialization from the domain of shapes, like beaks and wings, to computational mechanisms, subroutines, or computational systems. And so the idea is that if you want to build an organism like humans, or other animals for that matter, you want to bundle together lots of different subroutines or what I think of as little mini applications like you would have on your iPhone that together are useful for accomplishing lots of different tasks. So the way that you can get an advantage is by having mechanisms in your head that are specialized. So a visual system for vision, and within the visual system, object recognition, and within that, photoreceptors. So modularity is this idea that the mind consists of a large number of specialized devices, and this yields advantages by virtue of the gains from specialization.
Okay, great. And so, as we both know, and some members of the audience know, evolutionary psychology is often contrasted with something called the standard social science model. Maybe you could describe the SSSM, as it's called, and to work on that contrast, basically. So what is the SSSM, and what are the what's wrong about it, basically, that evolutionary psychology gets right?
So traditionally in the social sciences, people have been viewed as more or less blank slates with the ability to learn. And the claim is, of course, not from evolutionary psychology that people don't learn. Of course they do. But the standard social science model views culture as an uncaused cause. It's sort of something that's out there that's not particularly treated as the result of cognitive mechanisms. So what I would say the difference is really is the distinction between cause and effect. From the standpoint of evolutionary psychology, culture is the effect, the downstream consequence of evolved cognitive mechanisms, the thing in your head. Culture is what brains do. Now, that's not to say that culture, that is to say what other people think and the objects in our worlds, don't also interact with our brains to change the way that they organize themselves. That's completely true. But what evolutionary psychology has done and says learning is just another set of systems designed by the process of evolution by natural selection to enable us to do the tasks that we do as evolved creatures. So instead of seeing learning as this kind of black box that doesn't require further analysis or explanation, and instead of seeing humans as blank slates to be written on by the world, evolutionary psychology says, look, there's different instincts to learn, like the language instinct, as Steve Pinker says, and other learning mechanisms that produce culture as we understand it. So on the evolutionary psychology view, culture can be seen as an effect of evolved mechanisms rather than something which explains what humans do.
Great. Well, I'm going to jump in here and play a little bit the devil's advocate and give my sort of version of that. And let me begin by talking about what's called the adaptationist program in biological evolution, which more or less assumes that everything is heritable and asks what would be favored by natural selection. And so in that case, heritability is kind of a blank slate. We know that's not true. We know there's complex mechanisms, but we're going to pretend that heritable variation is a blank slate, and we're going to focus on what would be selected. Now, if we then fast forward to studying psychology as an open-ended process, we similarly might say, and we know that the mind's not a blank slate, but we're going to assume that people can behave just about, or any animal can behave just about any which way, and their behaviors are selected either by the environment or by reinforcers that evolve by genetic evolution. But at the end of the day, it amounts to a variation and selection process, and that means that organisms can learn to do just about anything in the same way that just about anything can evolve by genetic evolution. So now what's wrong with that account? One reading of evolutionary psychology is to say, well, actually, very complex mechanisms go into that variation and selection, which no doubt is true. But is there anything else wrong in that account? And so another way of putting it is, what does evolutionary psychology have to say about the open-ended capacity for change, to do something new that didn't evolve in the Stone Age? There's no module for it. It's a new thing that needs to be done. And people, or any creature, kind of happens upon it by a process of variation and selection, either individually as learners or as a cultural being, taking that on as part of a cultural store of information.
Well, I would want to pick up at what you said about open-ended programs. And when I have been reading recently in computer science, one of the things that I'm really struck by is the way the computer scientists talk about modularity as a means to obtain flexibility, not a constraint on it. So the way I think that some of us, at least in evolutionary psychology, think about modularity is as a way to think about all the possible combinations that you can form in terms of your mind or your representation. So I guess I would push back a little bit on this notion that you can do anything or think anything. The way I would sort of think about it is that every thought you have is generated by a thought generation system of some kind, or a combination of many different ones. And so when I think about the panoply of all possible thoughts humans can have, including the tools that we can use and political institutions that we can have, these are all the product of evolved computational mechanisms. And what I would say is that can be very large, open-ended, depends a little bit on how you want to use the term. But they're all kind of computational products, and they're also compositional. So you can get new ideas. You can have ideas about machines that have subcomponents which have subcomponents. And that kind of modularity, I think, is also reflected in cognitive modularity, the way we think about our minds. So I don't necessarily see there as being maybe as big a conflict as maybe you might think. I would resist the notion that humans and other animals can do anything and think anything. There I would say what natural selection has done is it's given rise to mechanisms which really are very, very effective at generating lots of new kinds of combinations of ideas, and I think language is a good example of that.
Well, I think, again, I agree with you about this, so I think that we're mostly in agreement. I think everything that you said also goes for the adaptationist program and evolution. You know, it's not the case that anything goes heritability-wise. There's mechanisms for everything. They're constraining. That was what Stephen Jay Gould was so eager to say. And a little bit more on caricatures before we proceed to your book. A previous person I've interviewed is Steve Hayes, who is comes very much from the behaviorist tradition, but is highly evolutionary in his own way. And one thing he says, I forget if he said it in his podcast, he certainly told it to me in conversation, is that behaviorists never use the word blank slate and never did. That's what other people say about them. And by the same token, I think one thing that's said about evolutionary psychologists is they use the metaphor of a jukebox. And so the way the mind is supposed to be is just like a jukebox with all these records. All these records have been caught in by genetic evolution. They're all waiting to be invoked by some environmental button. And so the image of the mind portrayed by evolutionary psychology is the mind as a jukebox. That's probably a caricature too, and I just wonder what you think of the jukebox metaphor and whether you think it's unfairly applied to evolutionary psychology.
Well, no, I think that is fairly applied, and I say that because my former mentors, John Tooby and Lita Cosmides, explicitly used the metaphor in The Adaptive Mind. And I think there is actually something which is really useful about the metaphor. And again, metaphors have limitations, right? So you don't want to take every single property from the source domain and apply it to the target domain. What they were trying to say there, which I think is true, is that humans are designed to flexibly respond to different kinds of environmental parameters. In some ways, the fact that we can is just kind of a jukebox. It means that in a place where it's sunny, the morphology is going to change in such a way that makes sense in the context of that amount of incident radiant light. And so in that sense, in the way that we respond to our local ecologies, social ecologies, physical ecologies, I actually do think that the charge, if you will, that there's a little bit of jukeboxness in evolutionary psychology, I think that's actually fair. Now, having said that, I would also say that it's been useful, I think, for helping people think about how you could have a human nature that is a real something which is in some sense real and passed down from one generation to the next, and yet you still see variability. That is, the variability could come from the ways in which we contingently respond to our physical and social ecologies. And I actually think that's a valuable idea.
Well, let me jump in again, because I think about this a lot. I love talking with you about it, and so happy to talk to you about it in a way that others can eavesdrop. But I think the right metaphor, just the right metaphor, is the immune system. And what's wonderful about the immune system is that it is richly innate, and that many aspects of it are exactly like a jukebox. That's called the innate component of the immune system. Then there's another component, which is called the adaptive component, a bit of a misnomer because it's all adaptive. But what the adaptive component is, it's the antibody system, which creates 100 million antibodies at random and then has a mechanism for selecting those that successfully bind to antigens. Well, all of that is richly innate and requires very detailed mechanisms. It's jukebox-like in that respect, but where it differs is in this open-ended variation and selection algorithm, what's sometimes called a Darwin machine that it implements. So it's not jukebox-like in that respect. And do you think that that's a good metaphor for the mind and for culture? Is that it has both the innate component, and so that's just jukebox-like in every respect. But then it has the adaptive component, which is also richly innate, but has an open-ended quality which is not captured by the jukebox metaphor.
I'm perfectly happy with the immune system, and for a couple of reasons. The first one is, the nice thing about the immune system is that you can talk about its function very naturally. As an evolutionary psychologist, and like most biologists, at the end of the day, what we care about is specifying the function precisely. And so the immune system can be defined, can be understood as having this function in terms of fighting pathogens. The other thing is, I would go back to what I said previously. I think that thinking about the immune system as open-ended in some sense misses something really important about it, which is that all of the antigens are compositional. That is, they're built from the units that are quote-unquote innate and put together in all these interesting new combinations in a way that's going to be effective for contingently responding to the particular pathogens that you happen to have around you. And so I actually do think that's a nice metaphor for the mind, because you have this idea of building blocks, and you have combinations, and that gives you novel antigens that never existed before.
100 million of them that can bind to almost any conceivable organic surface.
Again, this is the great feature of modularity. Once you have, 8 things, all of which have 2 settings, you have 2 to the 8th possible combinations. And now when you think about that in terms of neural architecture and the immune system, there's lots of combinations out there. So what I don't want to do is minimize the grandeur of combinatorics. I don't want to minimize the extent to which having pieces that have little settings that can be combined in new ways. I don't think that's limiting. I just think that using the term open-ended in some sense misses a little bit of the constructive element of novel representations and novel antigens.
Okay, but I can't resist. I want you to be my sparring partner, and so the fact that we agree on so much is very discouraging for me. But so given all of that which we agree upon, to me, it has the following outcome. Take a group of people, put them in a new environment, and let them adapt to the environment in the antibody way. Okay? So what they've done is they've adapted to their current environment. And so what you don't need to do, the best explanation for why they behave as they do is in reference to their current environment. As long as there's the antibody mode that we're working with, you actually don't have to reach back into the Stone Age, other than to say, yeah, the mechanisms of variation selection evolved back then. But it's not as if you have to go back and you have to talk about other things that you don't have to explain their current day behavior in terms of what happened in the Pleistocene environment. You can explain it in reference to adaptation to the immediate environment. And is there anything wrong with that, or is there some sense in which we actually need to go back and explain these things in terms of what took place in the during the genetic EEA, as opposed to the learning EEA and the cultural EEA? There's an EEA for every evolutionary process. Oh, and by the way, EEA stands for Environment of Evolutionarily
Adaptedness, yeah. Yeah, so here we do disagree a little bit. So I would say that in the same way that knowing that the immune system's function is to fight pathogens generates insights and new ideas about the way it's actually going to work. That is, you need to know the ultimate explanation if you want to have good predictions about the proximate mechanism. Because learning is a quite complicated process, and the way that learning works depends on the different domain in question. For example, you may not know this, but there's been a renaissance of research in religion from an evolutionary perspective, and many people think that the cognitive mechanisms for learning religious ideas, and I'm thinking now about people like Pascal Boyer, and I should just share the joke with your listeners. Of course, David Sloan Wilson has done some of the best work in the study of religion from an evolutionary point of view. But the idea here is that the way that learning occurs depends on the content of what's being learned. And so here I do think that you have to know how is the mind designed to learn in particular domains, and simply black boxing it, if you will, or packaging it all as learning in general is actually not going to be as effective as thinking about the systems designed to acquire information. Language learning is going to be different from tool learning, is going to be different from religious learning. That's my claim.
Okay, well, I think that's great. And once again, we do agree. The general rendering of that is that we want to study proximate and ultimate causation in an integrated fashion. Well, now let's get to your book. And why everyone else is a hypocrite, Evolution in the Modular Mind. And tell us a little bit about the book, why you wrote it, and what it says.
Yes, so one of the things, of course, that I think is very productive is applying the evolutionary approach to social phenomena. And what I wanted to do was start to think about a lot of different ideas that you see in the human social psychology literature and apply these ideas to those areas. So, for example, self-deception and self-control and, of course, hypocrisy, moral inconsistency. So what I do is try to lay out the very basic arguments about modularity, using some examples from neuroscience and from cognitive psychology and social psychology. And then I use those ideas to build up an argument about how you can have contradictory ideas in the same head. And those kinds of contradictions are visible everywhere from vision to how we understand ourselves, and then, of course, all the way up to morality, how we behave and how we think about moral rules.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much. That is why everyone else is a hypocrite, evolution and the modular mind. Thank you so much. I now have to go in search of another sparring partner with whom to disagree.
Thank you, David.
And this is David Sloan Wilson signing off for Evolution, This View of Life. Thanks for listening to This View of Life. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe in iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please consider rating it on iTunes and leaving a review to help others find the show. This View of Life is produced by the Evolution Institute, a nonprofit think tank whose mission is to provide science-based solutions for today's most pressing social issues in order to improve the quality of life. Learn more at evolution-institute.org. And if this view of life is important to you, then type TVOL 1000, TVOL 1000, to see how you can join the Darwinian Revolution.